När ett verk köps in till Moderna Museets samling så börjar man ju fundera på hur man ska skapa ett sammanhang kring verket. Och i det här fallet då Mary Kellys Post-Partum Document är del av vår konsthistoria och berikar, nyanserar bilden av 1970-talet på en mängd olika sätt. Idén att sätta samman hennes verk från 70-talet och hennes verk från nu, de senaste 10 åren, är att berätta för publiken, för Moderna Museets publik, om hennes konstnärskap, men också visa på hennes sätt att gestalta olika berättartekniker.
I started work on the Night Cleaners film in London in about 1970, and I had gone to London in '68 to St. Martin's School of Art. I was a post painter, if you like, in the moment of conceptualism, but also that was a time in Europe that was in absolute turmoil and change, the major social movements of the time, which included not only the anti-war movement, the student movement, but the women's movement. And I was really fortunate enough to be there right at the beginning of that. And in the time that we started to do the filming, there was a campaign to unionize low-paid women workers, and these were mainly in the cleaning industry. I was on the collective to represent the voice of the women's movement, but the film itself set out to really engage with 3 different discourses, one around the union, another around the women's movement, and another that had to do with the women cleaners themselves and their relation to children and to work in the home. These were all formative issues for my later work. Those kinds of debates that were current around domestic labor came together with my personal experience and generated something which I really hadn't anticipated the complexity of. It kind of ran against the grain of a certain common sense argument about the division of labor, suggesting that it would be enough just to understand this in terms of equal pay and equal work. And I think it made me much more aware, along with some other women at the time, that you needed to try to understand what the psychological underpinnings of this sexual social division of labor was. And I was having a child myself, so I set out to really document what that minute kind of daily activity meant in relation to the child. When I first started to take down exactly the sorts of things you'd be told to do anyway by the doctor, like let us know what you're feeding the child, right? So I just did it every hour of every day. And then I thought, well, the only way that you have of knowing how good you are at this is what comes out. So I didn't really use the stained nappy liners, the infamous nappy liners, because I was trying to be sensational, but because they were the record. They were the evidence. And it was also related to another rather important strategy for me, which was how to do this without a conventional image of the mother and child. I didn't want to use figurative image. So I wanted to use this kind of juxtaposition of narrative elements and found objects, really in the category of memorabilia, to signify something about the mother's experience, to put the spectator in the position of hearing her rather than looking at her. That is, thinking about the subject rather than the position of objectifying her. I mean, this is well understood now. It's no big deal to say this. But at the time, it was quite controversial. And I just ended up making almost everyone unhappy with that work. Because all the theorists would say, oh, it's great that you have this, you know, the critics said, I like the theory, but what do you have to have this stuff in there for? And then the women would say, well, I can relate to the experience, but why have you got that theory in there? So it was almost the fact that you had this limited audience in one way, artists, women, and involved in those issues of the movement that could perhaps get it. But in a very important way, it kind of stretched the audience out in these very, very different directions. And I was somewhat unprepared for that in the beginning, but I feel now that it was my specific site that may have come out of that movement generated the questions. It's like the first question was, what is this thing called femininity? And what specifically is like maternal femininity? And then after that, the question is, okay, what falls outside of this kind of maternal relation? What other kinds of object choice are there? And then, again, that question led to, well, you know, what about assumptions of masculinity in my later work? And by that time, we're up to the 90s and women asking for the right to go to the front and kill. So you obviously have to reconsider. Multi-story house is not actually meant to be a piece of nostalgic reminiscence about the past. In fact, I didn't think of doing it until I realized how obsessed, you could say, a certain group of younger women were with that period. And then as I got into it, I realized that they were born around that time. You know, it's people born around 68 to maybe the end of the 80s. And of course, this is something they think they know because their parents were involved in it. So I thought, well, let's call this the political primal scene. You know, as Freud says about the child wants to know where they came from. But you could say that there's something more than just this family saga that you inherit. It's a whole history. It's a kind of grand narrative that the child asks themselves, well, what are the parents really saying to me? What do they want? What did they miss? Which is also why that wonderful phrase of Walter Benjamin's about the secret agreement between the present generation and the past makes a lot of sense, because you think that secret agreement has something to do with what you feel you are supposed to fulfill that they missed out on. And I work with, well, you could say it's more like the voices that I hear. I never do interviews, but I take, elaborate notes all the time from my discussions with people. And this becomes the stuff of the anecdotal narratives that are in Multi-Story House. And around the outside, you see the stories that come from a younger generation. On the inside, it's mainly my friends from that period. But everyone is kind of reflecting in a rather loose way on what that experience that we loosely call feminist, where that comes from. And you can see that with my group, we're absolutely and utterly transformed by it. We say things like, well, I just was part of something bigger than myself, and I just, it was like a lightning bolt. That's what one person says. And with the younger generation, they say things like, well, my mother was feminist, so, yeah, I read Our Bodies, Ourselves when I was 8. But also they come from all over the world. Like another one says, well, I was dodging bullets in Angola, so it didn't mean much to me. There are all these intersections that are also very descriptive of this kind of moment of so-called globalization that we inhabit, and a very different way in which the discourse is constructed. But I think what I kind of discovered through this is it's not that something is, lost, as it were, that needs to be recovered, but that the appearance of the past in the present is the fascinating thing. And I've never seen it as a matter of one period being more activist than another, but it's the different conditions of existence that you're addressing.